November 1947. 17 miles north of Kalispell, Montana, where the Whitefish Range begins its climb toward the Canadian line. The war had ended 2 years prior, and the valleys were filling with men who wanted nothing more than distance from what they'd seen. One of them was about to solve a problem the old-timers swore couldn't be fixed. His name was Earl Hutchins, and what he did to his cabin that autumn would change how people thought about heat in the northern Rockies. But first, everyone had to stop laughing. If you want to see how one desperate decision produced a 70-degree temperature difference that silenced an entire community, hit that like button right now. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Because every week I bring you a real frontier technique that worked when survival wasn't optional. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know who else understands that the old ways weren't backwards. They were just ahead of their time. Earl Hutchins wasn't trying to prove anything. He was a 34-year-old former Army engineer who bought 40 acres of timber and a half-finished cabin with his discharge pay. The logs were good, lodgepole pine, 10 to 12 inches, stacked tight with oakum and clay chinking. The foundation was dry-laid river stone. The roof was split cedar shakes over rough-sawn boards. By every measure the old-timers used, it was a solid structure. But Earl had a problem the old-timers didn't talk about much. He was burning through his firewood 3 times faster than he'd calculated. By mid-October, he'd already gone through a cord and a half. At that rate, his winter supply wouldn't last past January, and the closest timber he could cut legally was a 2-day round trip by sled. The cabin wasn't poorly built. It was just built the way everyone built, for walls, a roof, a firebox, and a chimney. Heat went up. Cold came in through every crack, every seam, every place the wind could find purchase. The north wall, which took the brunt of prevailing winds off the mountains, was losing heat faster than the stove could replace it. Earl had insulated the interior walls with sawdust packed between the logs and an inner wall of mill boards. It helped, but not enough. Then he saw the Quonset hut. It was sitting in a field near the rail depot in Whitefish, a 20 by 48-foot military surplus shelter, corrugated steel, curved like half a barrel line on its side. The Army had used thousands of them as temporary barracks and storage during the war. Now they were selling them off cheap. $45 for the whole structure, hardware included. Earl bought it on a Thursday. By Saturday, he had it disassembled and stacked in his wagon. What he did next wasn't genius. It was desperation dressed up as a plan. He was going to wrap his cabin in it. The concept was simple, almost embarrassingly so. Earl re-erected the Quonset frame around the existing cabin, creating a second shell with an 18-inch air gap on all sides. The curved steel roof sat 5 feet above his cedar shakes. He left ventilation gaps at the peak and near the foundation to prevent moisture buildup. The entry became a short tunnel, 3 steps through the gap between the log wall and the steel exterior, with a canvas flap on the outside and his original plank door on the inside. It looked, by every aesthetic standard of the time, ridiculous. The technical reasoning, however, was sound. The air gap created a convective barrier. Wind couldn't strip heat directly from the log walls anymore. It hit the steel shell first, and the air trap between the 2 surfaces acted as insulation. The curved shape of the Quonset shed wind better than flat walls, and snow would slide off rather than accumulate weight. The metal itself, while conductive, would radiate absorbed solar heat inward during the day. More importantly, the outer shell eliminated the single biggest thief of heat in a frontier cabin: wind infiltration. Even the best chink logs have gaps. Even the tightest door has a draft. Earl's double wall system meant that cold air had to pass through 2 barriers, losing velocity and temperature before ever reaching the living space. He calculated, by firelight, in a notebook he'd carried since France, that he'd effectively doubled his insulation value without adding weight to the structure or moisture-trapping mass of the walls. On paper, it made sense. In practice, it looked like a homesteader who'd given up on pride and dignity. The first person to see it was his nearest neighbor, a man named Cletus Barber, who'd been running a trap line in the Rockies since before Earl was born. Cletus stood in the clearing for a long time, hands on his hips, staring at the curved steel shell. That, he finally said, is the damnedest thing I ever saw a grown man do to a house. By the end of the week, half the valley had heard about it. The jokes came fast. Earl's cabin became the potato cellar, the storage shed, the place where a man lives when he's afraid of being a man. One woman, the wife of a sawmill foreman, said it looked like Earl was hiding from the winter instead of facing it. But the harshest criticism came from a man named Robert Fisk, a timber frame builder with 30 years of experience and a reputation for craftsmanship that reached all the way to Missoula. Fisk had built the community hall, the church, and half the best houses in the county. He came out to see Earl's cabin on a cold Saturday in late November. He walked around it twice, didn't say a word, and then turned to Earl with an expression that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite pity. "You know what you've done?" Fisk said, "You've built a sweat trap. Come spring, that steel is going to weep condensation like a cow pisses, and your logs are going to rot from the inside out. You'll be tearing this whole mess down by summer, and you'll have to rebuild from scratch." Earl asked if Fisk wanted to come inside and feel the difference. Fisk didn't. "I don't need to," he said. "I know how heat works. And I know what happens when you try to outsmart the woods." What Robert Fisk and the rest of the valley didn't understand, or didn't care to, was that Earl had done something quietly radical. He'd turned his cabin into a primitive version of a double-envelope structure, a design that wouldn't become common in residential construction for another 30 years. The air gap was everything. 18 inches of dead air space meant that convective heat loss, the primary mechanism by which cabins bled warmth, was cut by more than half. Wind couldn't strip heat from the logs because it never touched them. The outer shell took the brunt of the weather, and the inner structure stayed comparatively calm. The ventilation gaps Earl had left weren't an afterthought. They were deliberate. Air entered near the foundation, warmed slightly as it rose along the log walls, and exited at the peak. This prevented condensation from forming on the interior of the steel shell and kept moisture from being trapped against the wood. Fisk's prediction of rot was based on a static system. Earl had built a breathing one. There was also the snow factor. The curved surface of the Quonset shed accumulation beautifully. What little snow stuck acted as additional insulation, nature's own R-value boost, without adding structural load. And during the brief daylight hours, the dark steel absorbed solar radiation and re-radiated it inward, a passive heat gain that traditional cabins couldn't replicate. The math, had anyone bothered to check, was undeniable. Earl had effectively created an R15 to R18 insulation envelope around an R5 structure. He hadn't added thermal mass, but he'd eliminated the mechanisms of heat loss that made thermal mass necessary. He wasn't hiding from winter. He was designing around it. The test came in the third week of December. A low-pressure system stalled over the Idaho Panhandle and sat there for 9 days. Temperatures dropped 18 below zero and stayed there. The wind came down from the north at 20 to 30 miles per hour, gusting higher, and it didn't stop. Snow fell in fine. Dry sheets that found every crack, every seam, every place a structure wasn't perfectly sealed. It was the kind of cold that makes fires hard to start and harder to keep. Firewood that had been dry in November pulled moisture from the air and burned sluggish, throwing more smoke than heat. Chimneys that had drafted clean in October started backfilling rooms with soot and carbon. People burned through their winter supplies in days, not weeks. Cletus Barber, Earl's nearest neighbor, was stoking his fire every 2 hours and still waking the frost on the inside of his windows. By the fourth day, he'd burned through a quarter core of split fir and was eyeing the furniture. Robert Fisk, the master builder, had to move his family into the kitchen and abandon the rest of his house to the cold. Even with a fire roaring in the cook stove and another in the parlor hearth, he couldn't keep the bedrooms above freezing. And Earl Hutchins, inside his steel-wrapped cabin, was feeding his stove twice a day. People noticed. Stay with me, because what happened next, what the numbers showed when someone finally measured it, humiliated every man who called Earl a coward. The results weren't close. They weren't even in the same category. On the 7th day of the cold snap, Cletus Barber walked over to Earl's place to borrow an axe. He knocked on the outer steel wall, waited, and then stepped to the canvas flap into the entry tunnel. The difference hit him before he'd taken 3 steps. Inside the Quonset shell, the air was still, not warm, still cold, maybe 20 degrees, but motionless. No wind, no draft. When he opened the inner door, heat rolled out like a physical thing. Earl was sitting at his table, in shirt sleeves. The interior temperature, according to a mercury thermometer hanging near the stove, was 63 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, it was 16 below. That was a 79-degree difference. Cletus asked how much would Earl had burned that day. Earl said he'd fed the stove that morning and wouldn't need to again until evening. 1 armload of split pine, roughly 20 pounds. Cletus had burned 6 times that amount by noon, and his cabin was barely holding 40 degrees. Word spread fast. By the end of the week, 3 men had come out with thermometers to verify it themselves. The numbers held. Earl's cabin, on average, maintained an internal temperature 68 to 72 degrees warmer than the outside air. In equivalent conditions, neighboring cabins averaged 45 to 50 degrees of differential, and that was with fires burning constantly. The fuel consumption was even more damning. Earl used 1/3 the firewood of a standard cabin over the 9-day cold spell. His fire burned slower, needed less tending, and held coals overnight. He woke to warmth. His neighbors woke to frost and kindling. The clincher came when someone checked the moisture content of the logs. Fisk had predicted rot. What they found was the opposite. The logs were drier than they'd been in October. The ventilation system was working exactly as Earl had designed it. No condensation. No mold. No decay. The steel wasn't weeping. The cabin wasn't rotting. It was just warmer, more efficient, and cheaper to heat than anything anyone in the valley had ever seen. Robert Fisk didn't apologize. Men like Fisk don't. But he did come back. He asked Earl to walk him through the design. He took notes. He asked about ventilation rates, about the width of the air gap, about whether the steel gauge mattered. Earl answered every question. By the spring of 1948, 2 cabins near Whitefish had adapted the concept. One man used salvaged tin roofing over a frame. Another built a pole barn structure around his existing house and insulated the gap with straw bales. Neither system was identical to Earl's, but the principle was the same. Create a buffer shell, manage the air, let the wind hit something expendable. Within 2 winters, at least a dozen homesteads within 50 miles had incorporated some version of the double shell concept. It wasn't always a Quonset. Sometimes it was a simple shed roof extended outward. Sometimes it was a second wall of mill boards with an air gap between. But the core idea, protect the thermal envelope from direct wind exposure, became standard practice for anyone building in exposed country. The phrase that stuck, according to local accounts, came from a woman named Ada Cormack, who'd been one of the harshest critics that first winter. She was talking to a group of neighbors in the spring, and someone brought up Earl's ugly shed. Ada shook her head. He wasn't being stubborn, she said. He was being practical. We were too proud to see it. By 1950, the joke had reversed itself. If you build a cabin in the northern Rockies without thinking about wind protection and thermal envelopes, people asked what you were trying to prove. Earl Hutchins never marketed the idea. He didn't write about it. He just lived in it. And that, in the end, was proof enough. The Quonset cabin wasn't a new idea. It was a very old one wrapped in surplus steel. Double-wall construction shows up in sod houses across the plains, in Inuit winter shelters, in Norwegian stabber, in Japanese minka with their mud and bamboo gap walls. The principle is universal. If you can't stop the wind, make it hit something that doesn't matter before it reaches something that does. What Earl understood, and what his critics missed, was that appearance and performance are different metrics. A cabin can look like tradition and bleed heat like a sieve, or it can look like a mistake and hold warmth like a thermos. The broader lesson isn't about Quonsets. It's about thermal thinking. Heat doesn't care about aesthetics. It moves according to physics, conduction, convection, radiation. If you design around those forces instead of around opinion, you end up with structures at work. The old-timers weren't wrong to be skeptical. They were wrong to stay skeptical after the numbers came in. That's the difference between tradition and dogma. Tradition tests itself. Dogma just repeats. Earl's cabin stood until 1979. When it was finally torn down, not from rot, but from age and disuse, the logs were still sound. The The steel had outlasted 3 roofs on neighboring houses, and the design had quietly become part of the regional vernacular, absorbed into the way people built without anyone remembering where it started. Sometimes the best ideas don't come from experts. They come from people who can't afford to be wrong. Now I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced? Drop it in the comments. And if you know someone who's building off-grid or dealing with brutal winters, send them this video, because the techniques that kept people alive 80 years ago still work, and they're still being ignored by people who think tradition means doing it the hard way. Hit subscribe. Turn on notifications. I'll see you next week with another piece of frontier engineering that modern builders forgot. Note, this content is educational and historical in nature. Any construction project should be undertaken with proper engineering consultation and in accordance with local building codes and safety standards.